see part 2 up there. I have a part 1, different topics, but came about because I grew up in Philadelphia. So this whole American Revolution was kind of cultural background, right? And then as I started to kind of learn more details about it, I realized, you know what, how much I didn't know. Okay, so it's one of those things, or what I thought I knew turned out not to be exactly right. So I kind of put this together, and it would go over different things. You know, you see the Liberty Bell there. That's what I'll start out with, but different, a few people, some things, objects like that, and then some events. Okay, so so to start off with the Liberty Bell, yeah, okay, so the story of that bell actually begins in 1751 when Pennsylvania, back then the colony of Pennsylvania, ordered a bell for the Pennsylvania State House, which we now know as Independence Hall. And so that was came from London, and when it arrived in Philadelphia, it actually cracked on its first test ring. Okay, so kind of not a good start. So they had 2 local workers actually melt the bell down and then recast it. And so those 2 men were John Pass and John Stowe, whose name is on the bell. Okay, so that's why their name is there, because it was their foundry that recast it. So so once they recast it, the bell got a lot of use, and in fact, people who lived near the State House actually started to complain that it was ringing so much. And they actually, and this is a quote from one of their complaints, they said that they were incommoded and distressed by the constant ringing. So now during the Revolutionary War, 1777, in September of that year, there was a battle of Brandywine Creek, south of Philadelphia, which we lost. The British advanced on Philadelphia, eventually occupied it. But it was at that time that the bell was actually moved to this church here, the Mount Zion Reformed Church in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And then the next year, when the British evacuated Philadelphia, the bell was returned to Philadelphia. Now, so obviously the bell is well known for its crack. However, the first crack in it actually did not happen until about the 1840s, okay? And that was after about 90 years of constant use. And so this is one of these things, you know, at least in my mind, this is how I always knew it. I thought, oh, you know, it must have been cracked during the Revolution, or no, it wasn't actually. So it wasn't until about the 1840s that this crack occurred. Now, in 1846, the city of Philadelphia decided to try to repair the bell in preparation for the George Washington's birthday. And so what they did was they actually had some metal workers actually widen this crack here. And you can see here a couple of rivets. And if you look like really closely, I'm not sure you can see that, but there's actually drill marks there. So what they did was they would drill out the crack and tried to kind of, you know, put these rivets in there to repair it. So it was a process called stop drilling. However, it didn't work. And during that process, a second very small crack right about here developed. So at that point, they said, okay, the bell is no longer useful. So, you know, that's why, so this wide crack in it that's so associated with the Liberty Bell is actually a failed repair job. Okay, so you can think of it that way. But don't tell anybody who's, you know, has a romantic notion about the bell. So now, before the Revolutionary War, the bell was known as the State House bell. And there's the famous inscription on it that reads, "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof." But it was kind of, you know, I mean, people knew it was there, but it really wasn't that a big deal. So it wasn't until about 1839 that that phrase took on new meaning, because in that year, the anti-slavery publication titled The Liberator contained the first documented use of the term Liberty Bell, but it also used that biblical quote, okay, as part of the abolitionist movement. Now, some interesting historical background on the bell is that Pennsylvania on the bell is actually misspelled. There's a N that's missing, and we focus on the bell, but the yoke here is obviously very old. However, historians are not sure if that's the original yoke, although they do know it's American elm. Okay, and believe it or not, ownership of the bell was actually in question for quite a while. And that was because, the Liberty Bell, they could no longer ring it because of the crack. So the city of Philadelphia wanted to replace the bell with a new one. And so they had a local bell maker here. And this is one of his bells, a man named John Wilbank. They said, okay, we're going to buy a new bell from you for Independence Hall. And you take this old one away and get the scrap value of it. Okay. And so, but then when he started to do the work, he realized that the value of the bell was less than what everybody thought it was. So he said, hey, I'm not getting paid the full amount. And so he just left the bell there. And then the city of Philadelphia sued him for breach of contract, right? So it goes to court, and then they eventually settled. But actually, over the years, you could see here a newspaper article, but John Wilbank's family actually tried to get the Liberty Bell back, and at one point they had an idea of melting it down for souvenirs. So thank God it never happened, but kind of a crazy story.
So the one that says Wilbank on it is a different bells, right?
Yeah, that's just an example of like one of the ones he cast. Yeah. So he was just a local foundry worker. Okay. All right. So, you heard a lot about the Liberty Bell over the last year, especially this past weekend, but also the Declaration of Independence. And so there's actually many versions of it. So the one right here is the one that's in the National Archives. That's the original one. Okay. But then after Thomas Jefferson drafted it, he gave it to Benjamin Franklin and John Adams to say, okay, what do you think? They made some corrections or edits or suggestions. And then that version was presented to Congress. And then they looked at it and they made their own changes to it. So there's two versions. So one's called the rough draft, which is that one that Adams and Franklin made adjustments to. And then there's something called the original rough draft, which has the edits by Franklin, Adams, and the Congress. Okay, so there's only one copy of this rough draft, and that's in the Jefferson Papers at the Library of Congress. Okay, so that's very early version. And then there's, and when on the night of July 4th, when the Declaration was adopted, there was the printer to the Congress, John Dunlap. He printed a bunch of copies, so they were a typeset copy. And then a little bit later on, there's this one called the Goddard Broadside. So this was was done in January 1777. So this was after Washington crossed the Delaware, the night of Christmas Day, 1776, Battle of Trenton. And then a few days later, there's the Battle of Princeton. So it was after that point that because they were both American victories, Congress felt comfortable enough to be able to print a copy of the Declaration of Independence. So on January 18th, a lady named Mary Catherine Goddard printed the copies as Congress had requested to have them sent to each of the states, okay, each of the colonies. So this Mary Catherine Goddard, she was a bookseller, a printer, and a postmaster to the Continental Congress, which was meeting in Baltimore from late 1776, early 1777. So she was local, she was handy, she was nearby. So they asked her to print this, a copy of the Declaration. Now, since the war obviously was still being fought, she actually took a risk because she put her name on it here. Mary Catherine Goddard, right? Even has Baltimore in there, so be pretty easy to track her down, you know, if things didn't turn out the way they did. So this copy, which is known as the Goddard Broadside, has several distinctions. And one of them is that it was the first time the names of those who signed the Declaration were made known publicly. Okay, so you can see the names there. And there was the first printed version of the Declaration specifically intended for preservation. And it was the first version to list the states of the signers. So you can see them grouped by state here. All right. And it was the first printed copy to use this phrase here, the unanimous declaration of the United States of America, of the 13 United States of America. So that's the first time that phrase had been used. Now, it lists 55 of the 56 signers because the 56th one signed a little bit later on after this had been printed. So in honor of Mary Catherine Goddard, she's mentioned at the U.S. Postal Museum in Washington, D.C., as well as Maryland's Women's Hall of Fame. All right. And there's many other versions of it, but this is one of the very early ones. All right, so another event everybody's heard of, I hope, Boston Tea Party, December 16th, 1773. And it was it's considered the first organized act of rebellion against British rule. And so the Sons of Liberty, who conducted this event, you know, we know that they were disguised as Mohawk or perhaps Narragansett Indians, but these disguises were poorly done, and it didn't really matter because the whole idea of disguising themselves was to show themselves as separate from the British, so to show themselves as Americans. And so this lady right here, Sarah Bradley Fulton, she is known as the mother of the Boston Tea Party and is credited with the idea of having these men disguised. And she was actually the sister of four of her brothers participated in the Tea Party. And she was a member of the Daughters of Liberty, so she was already very active. Now, so the Tea Party members actually boarded 3 ships, and these ships were actually American ships, right? That's one of those things. I just assumed they were British ships, but they were American ships carrying tea for the British East India Tea Company, okay? And this event dumped about 340 crates of tea into Boston Harbor, and that was equal to about 92,000 pounds of tea, worth more than $1.7 million today. So you can understand why the British were upset, right? And actually, other ports had tea parties too, but since this was the first one, you know, that's one everybody remembers. And in March of 1774, Parliament passed the Boston Port Act, which closed Boston Harbor until the bill for the tea was paid. Benjamin Franklin offered to pay the bill, but Parliament turned them down, so the harbor remained closed. Now, this is a term here, the Boston Tea Party. We learn it in school, you hear about it. However, that, kind of like the Liberty Bell, did not become popular until about the 1820s. And before that, it was known simply as the destruction of the tea. So the term Boston Tea Party was a little bit later. and it is commemorated. So actually in Boston, about 3 months after the first one, there was another Boston Tea Party. They boarded one ship and, did the same thing. Now, so there is a plaque there in Boston. You can see it here. And they think that's pretty close to where it took place. It was a place called Griffin's Wharf. However, over the years, there's a lot of backfill and Boston changed quite a bit. So they kind of lost track exactly where it took place. But they think that's pretty close to where the actual event occurred. Now, there's a organization called the Boston Tea Party Ships and Museum, which preserves the history of the event with a recreation of one of the ships here, and you can see that, and an annual reenactment. So people, tourists, you can see them there. They can throw these chests of tea into the harbor, right? So it's kind of neat. People can participate. And for the 245th anniversary of this event, there were several organizations got together to place commemorative markers at the graves of the participants. All right, so you can see this marker here and there to get an idea of what that looks like. And so they were placed at various cemeteries, and they're still doing that. And you can get an idea of what that looked like here. Okay. Now, that image was actually done by Nathaniel Currier. If you've heard of Currier and Ives, they were great illustrators in the 1800s. So Nathaniel Currier actually created this image. Now, if you look on the top right there, the Robinson tea chest is the only known surviving tea chest from the Boston Tea Party. So you can see what one of those chests look like. Now, this commemorative marker is actually officially known, or Nathaniel Currier entitled it, "The Destruction of the Tea at Boston Harbor." So again, not the Boston Tea Party, right? So it's interesting how these names kind of change over time a little bit. All right, so everybody knows Benedict Arnold, right? The bad guy, right? Right here, the traitor. Some people may know John Andre, British Army officer who was his accomplice in betraying America. However, there are three men here. You can see their names: John Paulding, Isaac Van Wert, and David Williams, who played a very important role in this whole story and were well known for quite a number of years, but over time, people have forgotten them. But to show you where they fit in, kind of at the end of the planning of Arnold's betrayal of America, which was to turn over to the British the plans for the fort at West Point in exchange for money and a commission as an officer in the British Army. So Andre here was his accomplice from the British Army. And so right at the end of their planning, they actually met at the house, or at a friend's house. Arnold and Andre met, but it was behind American lines. Okay, so Andre had to travel, came up the Hudson River on a ship and met Arnold. So he was behind American lines. So Arnold gives him the plans to West Point and he says, take him back to New York City so we can finish this betrayal. And in this painting here, you can see he's pointing to his boot, but he says, put the plans in your boot. And he wanted him to wear civilian clothing, even though he was a British soldier. Okay, so now he was going to return by ship, but that didn't work out. So he had to return by land. So as he's traveling through the American territory, and he was only about a half mile till he reached the British lines, he encounters these three men who were local farmers in the area trying to recover some stolen cattle, right? So they obviously, they don't know who Andre is. They ask him, start questioning him. He says, "Oh, I'm a British officer." And he said, "Well, how come you don't have a uniform on?" And then he tries to bribe them, and And then they quickly figure out, okay, something's amiss here. So they had him strip, and then they found the plans to West Point that he had put in his boot. Now, during that time, or before he left, with meeting with Benedict Arnold, Arnold gave him a pass to get through the American lines and gave him a false name, John Anderson. Okay, so I want you to remember John Anderson. Okay, so eventually, Andre was taken to an American outpost, had a military trial, was sentenced to death by hanging for being a spy because he was wearing civilian clothes. And there's a depiction of his hanging. And the spot where he was hanged is marked with this marker. And it's just on a kind of neighborhood side street now. But he was initially buried there and then later taken back to Great Britain. Okay. So those three men played a very important role. Now, Washington recognized this, and he actually had written to Congress suggesting a reward be given to each of the men for what they had done to expose this plot of betrayal. And so the three men were given a lifetime pension, and silver medallions were created, with Washington, making a big deal of it because he actually presented these medallions to the men in person in front of the Continental Army that was lined up for this event. So to Washington, he realized, oh, these guys kind of saved the day, right? Now, the New York State Legislature also rewarded each of the men with 200 acres of land. And they were, these men, like I said, were well known for quite a while. Now, in the early 19th century, there was an American sculptor who created a process for making life masks by spreading warm wax over the faces of the deceased, okay? So he did that for all three men, but here's Isaac Van Wert's mask. So we know what he looked like, right? Kind of neat. And then here's John Paulding. Now that's just a sketch, but those three life masks are actually in a place called Cooperstown, New York, which everybody associates with what? With baseball, right? But these three guys are right here. They're masked, and it's at this place, the Fenimore House of the New York State Historical Association in Cooperstown, New York. Now, so yeah, well, I was just going to move on to that. So, in 1853, this monument here, without the figure at the top, this was erected at the spot where those three men captured John Andre. Now, 27 years later, this statue was added to it, and it was donated by a local citizen, and this is in North Tarrytown, New York, but it was donated by a wealthy local citizen by the name of John Anderson. So remember I told you, remember John Anderson? The name Arnold gave to Andre. So it's just, sometimes I think history has a sense of humor, right? Yeah, so it's kind of neat. And then right across the street there's John Paulding Middle School, I think is what it is. So it's kind of neat that the names are still there in some form. All right, so has anybody heard of John Glover?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, oh, okay, good. Several, that's good. That's better than most groups. So most people don't know him, but he's one of the heroic figures of the Revolution and really performed some, amazing feats. So he was born in 1732 and in Marblehead, Massachusetts, and he was apprenticed as a shoemaker, but then eventually he bought a vessel and did well enough that he bought several more ships and served in the French and Indian War with the Massachusetts militia. Now, in August of 1776, the Continental Army is badly beaten by the British on Long Island, so western Long Island, what is now Brooklyn. And so So they had really, at the end of the day, been pushed up against the East River with the British essentially having them surrounded. However, Washington calls on John Glover and his regiment of seamen to evacuate the Continental Army at night over across the river to Manhattan. So here's a sketch of that happening. And so, you can think of it as the great escape of the Continental Army. But after that, he still had more things to do because as the British realized what happened and began chasing the Continental Army north in Manhattan, actually Glover and his regiment stays behind to try to delay the British, to give the Continental Army a little more time, get a little head start. So where they engage them is marked with this giant boulder here and this plaque that explains that. Now, so this wasn't the only thing he did because his soldiers handled the boats for Washington's crossings of the Delaware. And at the end of 1776, a lot of his troops were, their enlistments had expired, but they kind of served as a kind of informal continental navy. And so they became privateers for the American cause. And then later on, his regiments reformed and they play a very important role at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. And then also in the middle of 1778, the Americans attack Newport, Rhode Island, where the British are. However, it's unsuccessful. So who evacuates the army again? John Glover, yeah. So he's doing all these kind of miracle things. Now, even though most people never heard of him, there's a lot of things named for him. So there was this ship, the USS Glover, which was no longer in commission. It was, decades ago. And then there's the Glover School. There's his home, which is now, they're trying to save it because I don't know, developer wants to put some stores there or something. So there's been this effort to try to save his home. And on Commonwealth Avenue in Boston, there's a statue of Glover. And near where that battle took place, where that boulder was that I showed you, when they're trying to hold off the British, there's Glover Field right here. And then every year, there's a group of people that lead a march to his grave to observe the day he died. So, and Glover, his wife, and his sons are all buried there. So, interesting character for people who have never heard of him. Okay, so the story of Valley Forge, we know that story. However, it actually began before the army got there. So there's this famous painting, March to Valley Forge. And believe it or not, Valley Forge was not a sure choice for a winter encampment because each winter during this, this time, this century, armies would pretty much stop fighting during the winter time. So they'd go into a winter encampment. So Valley Forge was actually not a sure choice. Other locations that were considered were Wilmington, Delaware, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and a place called Gulf Mills, Pennsylvania, which is just a little bit to the west of Philadelphia. And so the army actually spent about a week there at Gulf Mills and then moved on to Valley Forge. Okay, so you can see there's a marker there for that. And there's another marker. And that's one of those things. I said, I was from Philadelphia. This thing is like 15 minutes from where I grew up. Never knew the thing was there. Okay. So anyway, but that's part of the Valley Forge story. Now, part of the route that the army took to get to Gulf Mills was something called they passed by the Hanging Rock. It was kind of like, a landmark, the Hanging Rock. And so you can see that in this sketch. But this is an older photo, but you can still see that rock there. And, traffic had to kind of veer around it. Now, they just recently, the last couple of years, realigned the road a bit and repaved it. So
Hit the road. Off we go.
yeah, yeah. So now, trucks aren't like crashing into it, but
Yeah.
yeah. So anyway, but it's kind of neat, that's still there. And so, um, kind of contrary to the national lore, weather was not actually the biggest enemy at Valley Forge, not to minimize it, but the biggest problems at Valley Forge was a lack of supplies, poor shelter. And you see, they built those cabins, but, a lot of folks didn't have very good shelter. Um, Disease, hunger, fatigue, and low morale. So, despite our impressions, the weather at Valley Forge, the winter of 1777, 78, was actually normal. Okay. Doesn't mean they weren't cold. Doesn't mean it didn't snow, but it was actually just normal for that time of year. Okay. Now, except for Valley Forge, the other winter encampments took place in New Jersey, in Morristown, which you can see where Morristown is there, right? North Jersey. And so there were kind of two locations. Most of the enlisted men stayed at a nearby place called Jockey Hollow, and that's actually part of the National Park Service. They have a nice visitor center there, and you can see a couple of these recreated huts that remind you of Valley Forge because it was kind of a standard structure that Washington came up with. Now, the winter of 1779 and 1780, again, one of the ones the Army was at Morristown, was one of the worst, one of the harshest winters of the century. And at the time, it was so bad, people referred to it as the hard winter. Okay. And so, to give you an idea of that, there were 23 snowstorms in 4 months. They had a 9-inch snowfall in mid March. There was a 4-foot snowfall in January. Okay. And again, like at Valley Forge, the same problems existed: lack of food, clothing, they had disease, things like that. Desertions occurred almost daily. And so it's interesting because now we celebrate Valley Forge because we know the Army survived and came out of it in better shape militarily than it went into it. However, during the war, the state of the Army at these winter encampments was not celebrated because, the U.S. or the Americans didn't want the British to know the condition of the Army. And they also really didn't want the French to know because that could maybe, cause them not to support us. And it was also embarrassing because it's really the state of the Army kind of reflected a lack of support from the Congress. So there are many reasons not to advertise the state of the Army during these winter encampments. Now, while they were there at Morristown, Washington stayed at the home of a widow, Theodosia Ford, in this house. He and some of his staff stayed there, and that's a place you can tour now. There's a visitor center behind it. It's a very nice place to visit. And what's it? Oh,
Nice house.
yeah, yeah. It's a beautiful, huh?
Mhm.
Morristown, New Jersey. Yeah. So is that at this time during one of these winter encampments that the New Jersey governor, so the American governor of New Jersey, uh, kind of got wind of maybe a British attempt to kidnap him. So, because he was pretty close to Morristown, he sent word to Washington and said, "Hey, we're hearing things about a possible kidnapping attempt on me. We want to make sure that you're aware of it, General Washington." So, Washington took precautions. They put additional outposts out, and then they filled in some gaps with cavalry under the American General Arthur St. Clair right here. And so So the British actually did try to kidnap George Washington. So this plan was formulated by this guy right here, Captain George Beckwith, British captain. And in February 1780, they actually did attempt to kidnap George Washington. And that was led by Lieutenant Colonel John Simcoe right here. However, that terrible winter weather I just described to you, that actually ended up preventing the success of an attempt to kidnap George Washington. So you can imagine the effect that would have had on the war. But the kidnapping unit that was led by Simcoe here actually encountered the additional cavalry that St. Clair had put out there. So they clashed and drove the British back to Elizabeth, New Jersey. So thankfully, that kidnapping attempt failed, but you can imagine what a huge effect that would have been. All right, so so during armies around the world during this time, the conditions were like any enlisted men serving in the army. It was like conditions were terrible. They were harsh. Discipline was harsh. Conditions were bad, and so there were attempted uprisings by the American troops throughout the war, beginning even in 1776. But when you look at them overall, there were actually not that many. However, there were a few that were prominent. So the first one I'll talk about, 1778-79, took place in Reading, Connecticut, which you can see right here. And that's where the Eastern Division of the Continental Army was located. So they were in their winter encampment. And so these soldiers attempted an uprising. They were going to march to the capital of Hartford to make their case. However, this attempt was put down by a rousing speech by General Israel Putnam, who was in command of that Continental Army located in Reading, Connecticut. Now, that spot, excuse me, Reading, Connecticut, is known as Connecticut's Valley Forge. So you can see here, that's like it's a park, right? That's one of those things I never heard of before, right? You always hear about Valley Forge, but there's, they call it Connecticut's Valley Forge. So that was their winter encampment where that portion of the army survived. Now, so the next year, the next winter, in Morristown, New Jersey, a group of soldiers from Connecticut, again, attempted an uprising. They were protesting their conditions and actually threatened, you can see this painting here, threatened their officers with bayonets. However, a shipment of meat, okay, food was always an issue. A shipment of meat calmed things down for a while. So they said, okay, well, we can eat now. So you can see, what their condition was like, right? But the next winter, there were continuing signs of, discontent. So in 1781, January, a group of Pennsylvania soldiers left Jockey Hollow in Morristown to march to Philadelphia to petition Congress for better pay and conditions. Now, they were met by a congressman from Pennsylvania. They met them in New Jersey. He kind of diffused the situation. The soldiers returned to Morristown. However, just 2 weeks later, there was another attempted uprising by a group of New Jersey troops, New Jersey soldiers. And again, they intended to march to the capital of Trenton to air their grievances. So, you see a pattern here. So finally, Washington says, okay, we got to get rid of this. So there was a unit from West Point that chased down these New Jersey soldiers and rounded them up and actually selected. So they found out who the 3 ringleaders were, and then they selected the remaining soldiers of those mutineers to execute the 3 ringleaders. Okay, so it's just like, oh, okay, I'm sending a message, everybody. No more uprisings. Now, all those things I just described were enlisted soldiers. However, there were similar events with the officers. And so what's known as generally known as the Newburgh Conspiracy was an attempted uprising by the officers in March of 1783. And so, not surprising, same issues, overdue pay, whether they would have a pension, their conditions in general. And so, so these officers knew that Washington would not allow this whole situation to be resolved by an uprising. However, he was kind of in a bad position because he really couldn't solve the situation himself. He couldn't, he couldn't pay all his officers, but he also was very strong on the point of the military being subservient to the civilian control. So he didn't want the military to take over what was the government at the time. So he was aware that this was going on, and you can see in this recreation here, these officers had a meeting plan, and it was kind of, things were coming to a head. However, as the commander-in-chief, he canceled the meeting, but then had it rescheduled 2 days later, March 15th, which historians say he did on purpose because it was the Ides of March. He understood history and, little dramatic flair, I guess. So he went to this meeting, and he had a speech prepared, trying to calm things down, which he had written. At this point in his life, his eyesight was deteriorating. So he had written the speech in large script so he could read it. However, the speech that he read fell flat, didn't sway the officers. So in desperation, he began reading a letter he had received from a congressman, and that was written in small script by the congressman. So in order to read it, Washington put on a pair of glasses that he had been testing for just a week, right? So, all these officers here, they'd never seen him wear glasses before. So here's this show of weakness. But as Washington put on his glasses to read this letter, he offhandedly remarked, "Gentlemen, you must pardon me. I have grown gray in your service and now find myself growing blind." So at that point, the officers realized, oh, we still have to follow this guy, and then that was kind of the end of it. But the most important thing, so, within about 2 months, Congress resolved the pay issue, but the most important thing was the subordination of the military to civilian control. And this is now this was rebuilt, but this is the place where that, Newburgh Conspiracy took place, and you can see what the inside looks like there. Okay, so at this point, 1783, Battle of Yorktown has taken place. However, the war is not officially over. So the Continental Army under Washington is located in Newburgh, near New York City, in order to keep an eye on the British in case something happens, some fighting starts again. But during the Revolution, New York City was the most important city because it was a major port and it was on a lot of waterways. So, but the British had occupied it for 7 years, and at the end of that occupation, it was a wreck because there were 2 different fires, and you see a drawing of one here that destroyed about a third of the city during the war, and schools were closed. Most of the trees have been cut down for firewood. There was no sanitation pickup, trash pickup, things like that. It was really, really in horrible shape. Now, so when the royal governor, the British royal governor, Guy Carleton, received official word of the signing of the Treaty of Paris, which officially ended the war between the U.S. and Great Britain, he arranged for the evacuation of 30,000 British and Hessian troops and about 27,000 civilians from New York and various areas. So this royal governor, Carleton, ordered this British evacuation of New York to occur by November 21st, 1783. And 4 days later, American troops entered New York City, which became known as Evacuation Day, November 25th. And so when Washington entered the city, let's see. Oh, he rode alongside the New York governor. So the American governor, George Clinton, as a sign of respect, again, to show deference of the military to civilian authority. So Evacuation Day, November 25th, was celebrated in New York City for over a century, but was eventually overtaken by Thanksgiving. So, now, during the British evacuation of New York, they left a little present for the Americans, which was this Union Jack flag still flying. And until the American flag was raised, like, New York could not officially be taken over by the Americans. However, they had put that, they put that flag up there, but then they had removed the halyard that you use to raise and lower the flag. They greased the pole and they nailed the flag to the pole. Okay, so they weren't gonna make it easy. However, this young man, a sailor named James Van Arsdale, volunteered to go up there to remove the flag, but the pole was greased. He couldn't do it. So he and some buddies essentially went to a hardware store, got pieces of wood, nailed it, kind of making a ladder to go up there so that he could remove the British flag and raise the American flag, and New York could officially be back in American hands. Now, the day that the Americans re-entered New York, November 25th, Evacuation Day, there was a celebratory dinner held at this place, Flounce's Tavern in Manhattan. And this was owned by this gentleman, Samuel Flounces. And Washington had actually met him early in the war because he attended a court-martial in his tavern. But they had a long relationship, which lasted because Samuel Flounces actually became the first presidential steward in 1789 when Washington, was president of the United States. So this tavern, so it's the Flounces Tavern Museum, they hold an annual Evacuation Day and Washington's farewell celebration on the Sunday closest to December 4th, okay? So why is that, December 4th? We had Evacuation Day, November 25th, December 4th. What's special about that? Well, on December 4th, Washington received word from the Royal Governor, Guy Carleton, that the last of the British troops had left New York. Long Island, Staten Island, everybody was out. So December 4th was a big day. And it was on this same day that Washington invited about 30 officers to join him at Flounces Tavern for one last celebration and to bid his officers farewell. Now, I'm going to read you a couple of quotes here because these are very descriptive. But there's only one known complete account of this event, which took place in this room here, which is called the Long Room because it's rectangular. But this account was written by Colonel Benjamin Talmadge, and it records Washington's words, which were, "With a heart full of love and gratitude, I now take leave of you. I most devoutly wish that your latter days may be as prosperous and happy as your former ones have been glorious and honorable." Okay, so Talmadge's account continues and says, after the officers had taken a glass of wine, General Washington said to them, "I cannot come to each of you, but shall feel obliged if each of you will come and take me by the hand." So you can see in this painting here, General Henry Knox, who was the officer standing closest to Washington, walked up to the general, and the two hugged and kissed with tears running down their faces. Now, Talmadge continues his account describing this. He says, "In the same affectionate manner, every officer in the room marched up and parted with the general-in-chief. Such a scene of sorrow and weeping I had never before witnessed, and fondly hope I may never be called to witness again." And this was the last time many of these men would see each other. All right, so after that, Washington leaves New York City, stops in Philadelphia, and ends up in Annapolis, where he would resign his commission as commander-in-chief because that's where Congress was meeting at the time. So on December 23rd, 1783, Washington addressed Congress for the last time as General of the Continental Army. And he delivered an emotional speech to Congress. And part of what he said was, having now finished the work assigned me, I retire from the great theater of action, and bidding an affectionate farewell to this august body, under whose orders I have so long acted, I here offer my commission and take my leave of all the employments of public life. So this was, as I said, an emotional event for Washington, and during his speech, his voice faltered and sunk several times. And then he handed his commission as commander-in-chief and a copy of his address to the president of Congress, Thomas Mifflin, right here. And so that's one of those, again, going back to my childhood, 5-minute walk from my house was Thomas Mifflin Elementary School. Never knew who that was, right? Just some guy, right? But here he is, Thomas Mifflin. So, then Washington made some formal goodbyes. He left Annapolis and made it home to Mount Vernon in time for Christmas. Now, there was a delegate here in the crowd, James McHenry, who described this event. And part of what he wrote was, the events of the revolution just accomplished, and the great man who had borne so conspicuous a figure in it, in the act of relinquishing all public employments to return to private life, conspired to render it a spectacle inexpressibly solemn and affecting. And upon learning of Washington's resignation from public life, it is reported that British King George III said, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. So Washington left Annapolis December 23rd, made it home to Mount Vernon on Christmas Eve, just before dark and just as snow began to fall. And greeting him, you've seen this painting, it's a little hard to see, I have the arrow there, but greeting him was his wife Martha, who had traveled to be with Washington and the Army at every winter encampment during the war. Now, Washington wrote simply a few days later, December 28th, I arrived at my seat the day before Christmas, having previously divested myself of my official character. I am now a private citizen on the banks of the Potomac. Okay. So that's the end of my slides here.